all this stuff just feels very, very totalitarian. It feels very Soviet to me. And if you look at some of the things that she's said in the past, I mean, most recently, on January 25th of this year, she said the biggest challenge in identifying this content, meaning disinformation, both for our team and for platforms, which again suggests very strongly that she's talking about some form of regulation over social media in this case, which means that she's going to be compelling social media outlets to regulate speech, which is just absolutely a First Amendment violation.
They already are.
I mean, they already are, right? The government is actually already doing this to some extent, and it needs to be challenged.
But now they're saying the quiet part out loud.
Now they're saying the quiet part out loud. It says the biggest challenge in identifying this content, both for our team and for platforms, is what we've dubbed malign creativity, the coded language, memes, and context-based content which allow harmful posts to avoid detection. Now, what she's talking about, obviously, is that like you can use machine learning and algorithms to flag certain phrases, words, things like that, right? So if somebody says a racial slur, if we have a list of racial slurs that we all want to ban, then it's very easy for machine learning to detect the use of racial slurs and ban those posts, ban those users, et cetera. The problem, of course, is that once people realize that those are the rules, then they start using memes, or they start using images, or they start using words that are coded to mean the slur or the whatever it is besides, you know, the actual thing. And then in the end, it just becomes this weird game of whack-a-mole for all these companies where they just keep racing to find the next thing. And the problem with it, there's multiple problems with this. One, automation is just a terrible tool for this kind of work. The other thing too is that it very quickly it comes to a point where all of their automated tools misunderstand differences in context that are really important. So somebody's joking, somebody's making fun of somebody using one of these sort of coded means of communication. But also these kinds of coded messages also are faked in many cases. So we've seen this from like 4chan and stuff like that over the last few years, right? You remember the OK symbol coming up, and then everybody's, oh, it's a symbol of white pride. It was not that. It never was that. It was just somebody trying to game journalists into writing a story that said, you know, white nationalists are using the OK sign to mean white pride. They weren't really doing that. It wasn't really a thing, but it's very easy to game these systems because these people are on the lookout for whatever coded message they can find, and they're very gullible as a result. So there's all these problems with this. But then one of the things that drives me insane about this is that it reminds me so much of something that when I was in graduate school, I was in graduate school at New York University, and the head of the composition program, music composition program, was a man named Dino Getsu. Dino was a Romanian man who was in his 70s by the time I knew him. He's died since, but Dino lived in Romania under Ceausescu, the dictator, Soviet.
Yikes.
Communist dictator. And so what he would tell me stories about how, like all dictators pretty much everywhere, like it almost immediately start banning speech, but they also ban art. They ban certain kinds of art, right? And so one of the things that was banned in Romania, as was banned in Russia and many other places, is Western music. So they weren't allowed. Cuba did the same thing. You weren't allowed to reference or perform or write music that they would identify with Western Europe or America. And those were sort of no-nos as far as what he was allowed to do. And they had, government agencies that were dedicated to rooting out whether or not you're violating these rules. The thing is, the government people were not great composers or musicians or anything like that. They were just people who were, willing to do this horribly dirty job because the government paid them to, and because, they would probably get arrested if they didn't. And so what Dino told me was they used to do exactly these kinds of things. They did coded versions of Western music. He and other composers in Romania would include references that they understood because they were sophisticated and they understood the meaning of what they were doing. Like maybe they do a piece of music that was a clear, something like Aaron Copland or something like this, very American composer. But they do it backwards, or they do it inverted, or they do, whatever it was, so that if they were some other composer who was really sophisticated, they get it and they get the point, but the censors wouldn't get it, right? And the reason people end up doing all these coded things is because of the censorship, right? Like it should be fairly obvious. Like the whole point of the coded versions of this is because they've been banned in other ways. Well, the government getting involved in this is insane. I mean, that's a huge recipe for disaster, but it's also a recipe to get all these things wrong and then jail people or fine people or do whatever the Department of Homeland Security is going to do that is going to get all this stuff wrong. I mean,